Welcome everyone to my masterclass, Learning How to Learn. Yes, this is the recording actually, so if you were not able to join me live on June 28th, I hope you like this one. It's not going to be as interactive, but well, it's what we can do, right? And let me tell you something. I actually don't like this name, Masterclass. Sounds like a scam or sounds like, Martin Scorsese or Spielberg should be doing this about cinema or, video making, whatever. Because I don't know. I think this is something that people use to promote things. I am using this to promote things, so of course. But I really hope that I'm doing that ethically because I've studied a lot to say the things that I'm about to say to you. And well, I do hold a master's degree. So, master, I am teaching a lesson, a class. So, class, okay, I'll just let it go for now. Let's go for it. Yes. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is André Hedlund. Very nice to meet you officially. I'm an educational psychologist. I'm an author. I've written a couple of books about the science of learning, about the owl factor. That's my first book, in case you're interested. I've worked with ELT folks, different levels, different jobs. I've been a teacher for 20 years. I am also a guest lecturer in some courses here in Brazil, certificate programs. I teach language, cognition, bilingualism, science of learning. I'm also the current leader of the Mind, Brain, and Education Special Interest Group for Brastiso. And you can find out more about what I've been doing lately if you go to Instagram at The Learning Cosmos, or if you check out my website, learningcosmos.com.br. I will tell you more about where to find the things that I usually share so that you can become more aware of this amazing, incredible science, the science of learning. But before I tell you more, let's start with this very interesting parable that I don't know exactly where it comes from. I've seen from different sources that this is a Buddhist parable or maybe Hindu or something like that. It's thousands of years old, and it's called The Blind Man and the Elephant. Yes. So it goes something like this. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must inspect and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So they sought it out, and when they found it, they groped about it. The first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, "This being is like a thick snake." The blind man who placed his hand upon its side said, "The elephant is a wall." And another who felt its tail described it as a rope. Well, what does this tell us? I really like this parable because I think this is the perfect illustration of how our own experience is rarely the whole truth. I think, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Yes. So by no means will I be able to cover everything you need to know about the science of learning in the next couple of minutes. Even if you take one of my courses, you won't learn everything there is to know about the science of learning. I am still learning, even though I've been working in this particular area for a couple of years now. But I think it's really important for me to help raise awareness because I don't think we are, as teachers, as educators, as families, parents, and even students, using what works best or what should work best based on basic principles of how we learn. That's why I wanted to offer this masterclass for you to become more familiar with some terminology, some important concepts. And who knows, maybe you will go do your search, your own research, even though that can be very dangerous as well. And I'm sure you know why, right? So we are going to talk about how you learn, how people learn in general. I hope you can interact with me, even though this is recorded. So I'll ask you a couple of questions and you try to think of possible answers. And then how that relates to the idea of metacognition. Then I will test your knowledge, fact or myth. And then we'll focus more on the evidence. Where does the evidence come from? What is this area that can help us? What actually works according to research, according to the evidence. And then I will tell you more about my work, the Learning Cosmos Hub, some professional development possibilities for you in case you're interested. But let's take a moment to think about how we learn. How do you learn? Have you ever thought about that? Well, if you want to pause this video, that would be great. Let me give you some context and then you try to think of possible answers. Let's imagine you're studying something like an additional language and there's an exam coming. So you have a couple of weeks before the exam and you have a teacher, you have access to a lot of different materials, you have books, you have your notebooks, you have tutorials on YouTube, you have anything you want, right? You have apps to help you with certain words, constructions. How would you study for this exam? What techniques would you employ to make sure you get a good grade? Okay? Think about that. If you want to pause the video, go ahead. Think about that and then come back here. Okay, I don't know if you paused the video. I hope you did, but I am very positive that some of you answered things like, okay, if I have an exam, I would probably start by rereading the books. After all, the content is there. And some of you probably said highlighting my notes or even books, Some people love to do that, highlight books or underline certain things, right? Maybe summarizing. And you can use Post-its to do that. I love Post-its. I have many here. And maybe some of you said something like, well, cramming or blocking. So if I am going to study that, I will study that for many hours on the same day until I really get the meaning of things, until I feel comfortable and confident that I will be able to perform. Here's the thing. What if I told you that even though these are very popular ways of studying, they are not exactly the most effective ones? And it's not me saying. There's a number of papers now that you can find that address this. This is one of my favorite papers. It was written by two amazing authors I admire and their colleagues, John Dumlosky and Daniel T. Willingham. I have his book here, Outsmarting Your Brain. Excellent book. And Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques, Promising Directions from Cognitive and Educational Psychology. Now, here's the thing. When you look at common strategies or techniques that we use to learn or to study for an exam in this case, they are not necessarily very useful when it comes to actually learning. So I'm not saying that they're not going to help you pass the exam. They might, come on. I know some of you here have pulled an all-nighter, like doing everything, trying to study something that you were not paying attention, particularly, let's say, in class, and then so you spent the whole night studying, and you know what? Maybe you actually got a good grade. But I can guarantee that a couple of hours after the test, a day after the test, a couple of days after the test, you probably couldn't remember much of the content you studied, right? So when you look at summarization, when you look at highlighting, when you look at rereading, they're not very useful for learning. And That's very interesting. I think it's a paradox, right? Because why do we believe that those things work? Because, they were asking students what techniques they use. They listed the techniques and asked students. And when you ask students, they will rate those techniques as actually quite effective, even though they're not. So why do we believe them? Well, maybe we're not metacognitive enough. Maybe we don't know how to learn very effectively. I guess what I'm trying to say, in other words, maybe we're not very good at judging by ourselves what works and what doesn't work when it comes to learning. And metacognition has to do with that. As a matter of fact, metacognition can be described as learning how to learn or thinking about your own cognitive processes so that you can improve them, let's say. And metacognition involves different levels. I like this model by Nelson and Narens because they say that metacognition really starts at the object level. So that's the cognitive level. So how does one become metacognitive? First, you have to be cognitive, right? First cognition, then metacognition. But we are all cognitive. We can say that even animals are cognitive to a certain extent, right? After all, they think, they judge things, they make decisions upon their judgment. And if you are a cognitive being, you should be able, or you should have access to your cognitive capabilities in order to sort things out, in order to learn things, in order to solve problems, right? So basically, being cognitive means that you have access to cognitive tools that can help you do things, right? So attention is a cognitive task or a cognitive process, working memory as well. So for you to learn anything, you need to have those things. So if you're learning, let's say, how to solve a math equation, the cognitive or object level means that you have the tools to solve that problem. You know how to do it. You can learn how to do it, right? But then, for you to rise to the meta level, to the metacognitive level, you need to start doing certain things. For example, monitoring. So let's say you're trying to understand what you're reading, and you can ask yourself, am I able to understand this excerpt, this paragraph? When you start asking those questions, then you will rise to the meta level. And this has a lot to do, it has everything to do with metacognition, right? So when you get to that level, you start wondering what works best for you to learn more effectively. So it's about questioning. It's about having the knowledge and the skills to make sure that the strategies or techniques you're using are effective or not. And if they're not, changing them, transforming your study session, right? Now, when you become more metacognitive, you can control the object level. So, well, you check for understanding, you realize you cannot understand what this paragraph is about. So that means, okay, maybe I should reread the paragraph or read it slower to ensure comprehension. So that helps you control. So this is a process. It's a loop, actually, that the more cognitive you are, the better chances, let's say, for you to become more metacognitive, right? And then as you become more metacognitive, you start questioning your cognition and you try different things to see if they work better. Now, it looks pretty easy, I suppose, right? But I just told you a moment ago that rereading is not very effective. Well, it's not that simple. It might be effective at the beginning when you're receiving input. So if you're reading something and then you have not understood what that meant, you have to read again. You're encoding information. So it might be necessary for you to read again. Sometimes we read things over and over and we still don't get it, so we need something else. But maybe you have to read slower and read again. Rereading is not very effective at the consolidation phase, right? When you actually want to get, to get information from your working memory into your long-term memory. Rereading gives you a false sense of fluency or competence, and that is not very effective when it comes to actual learning. So it's not that simple, right? You have to understand the stages. You have to understand when you are learning, when you are consolidating, when you're exposed to the information, when you're trying to make sure that information is readily available to you, at a later time, right? Yeah, that's why metacognition is very important. And that brings me to this man, the father of metacognition. So we could say that metacognition is the brainchild of this man. Back in the 60s, he was the one who coined the term metacognition, and he categorized metacognition into two different realms, we might say. So first, you need to have metacognitive awareness. So you have to be aware that there might be certain things you can do to improve your cognition, to learn better, to learn how to learn, let's say. There might be certain things. And then when you learn about those certain things, certain strategies, techniques, even just questioning if the things you're doing are working or not, that brings you to metacognitive regulation. And that's more like the knowledge and the skills required for you to adjust your learning process accordingly. So if you just do the things you do because somebody told you that they work well, because that's how your teachers taught you and probably how their teachers taught them before before anything happened, let's say, that is not particularly metacognitive because you're not questioning if things are working effectively or not. Now, the question that I have here is, can we say that there are certain people who are not metacognitive at all? What do you think? If you want to pause the video and reflect on this for a while, be my guest. If you don't pause the video, I'll just keep talking, okay? But here's the thing. Human beings are metacognitive. We are all metacognitive. We might even say that animals, to a certain extent, are metacognitive. They learn from making mistakes and they try to adjust things. Of course, we can do that better usually because we have a very powerful brain. So let's say you are in a relationship that doesn't seem to be working, and you start asking questions. How can I make this relationship better? So what can I do? How can I turn things around? That's metacognition. Or let's imagine you are trying to cook for your friends and you decided you're going to make some spaghetti alla bolognese, for example. And if you wonder if it's tasty, if you follow the recipe right, or maybe the recipe might not be working, you don't have the right ingredients, that's also metacognitive or metacognition. The difference between not being metacognitive and being metacognitive has a lot to do with questioning why things work, why they might not be working as much or as effectively as they could be working. So if you wonder if the things you're doing are the best way you can achieve what you intend to achieve, you are being metacognitive. But of course, I'm talking more specifically here about learning, how to learn, right? So maybe we're not very metacognitive when it comes to learning. Yes. Well, let's think about this, okay? Do you know what the facts and the myths that are propagated out there when it comes to learning are? Have you heard any of them? I'm sure you have some, and that's why I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And I'd really appreciate if you could pause the video and try to answer before you listen to me give you the answer. So let's test fact or myth. How do you think you are better? How do you rate your knowledge about learning? and what makes the brain learn, what makes the mind learn, okay? From 0 to 10. If you want to pause and think about it, that'd be great. Now, if you haven't paused, I hope you're ready because I'm going to ask you the questions, okay? So you just have to tell me, fact or myth. The first one is that learning according to your preferred learning style makes a lot of sense, is very effective. Fact or myth? Okay. The second one is multitasking is an effective strategy when you're trying to learn. So the more things you're doing, the better. Yeah? Fact or myth? Okay. The next one has to do with if you're teaching people who are more right-brained, you should use artistic stuff, musical stuff, more creative stuff. Fact or myth? And explicit teaching, also known as direct instruction, although they might be different, is one of the worst possible ways to teach someone and to learn ourselves. Yep. Fact or myth? Well, let me share the results with you. All of those are actually considered neuromyths. Okay. What do you mean? So we know that multitasking is terrible for learning because it fragments your attention. And attention is essential if you're learning anything new because you have to ascribe or assign your attention to the stimuli that are coming from your teacher, from the environment, from the board, from the video, from the audio. And without attention, those things will not get into your working memory. And then there's nothing for you to consolidate later on. So multitasking is quite bad. So what does that tell you about your phone that you might be using right now to check your Instagram notifications, right? Yeah. Okay. But we'll talk more about that some other day. Now, the most prevalent neuromyth, and a neuromyth is a myth about the brain, about how the brain learns, how the brain works, is that we learn best if taught according to our learning style. So you can take one of those online tests and you will be categorized as, I don't know, auditory, visual, kinesthetic. And if you receive information according to that style, you will learn best. This is not true. It's not very plausible to think about that in those terms because of how the brain works, how we encode information, how working memory works, and what are the different parts of working memory. And if you look at the evidence, there have been systematic reviews and meta-analysis showing that if you match the student to their alleged learning style, because they've taken a test, right, to find out, they're not going to learn better than a control group that actually receives information according to different input or modalities, right? Yeah, and this is very prevalent even today. A lot of teachers around the world believe that this is actually true, but it's not true. And hemispheric dominance, if you're more right-brained or left-brained, this is not really true. There have been, again, certain things that contributed to this neuromyth. Split brain surgery, for example, when you cut or you segment the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers that connects both hemispheres. And then there are different patterns of activation on one or the other. And not just that, normal, regular brains with the corpus callosum working fine will have different patterns of activation depending on what we're doing. So language is more ascribed to the left hemisphere. Most humans, you will see certain areas in the left hemisphere activating when we are producing language and understanding language. For example, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, usually left side. But to say that a person who's left-brained is more analytical, more logical, mathematical, fails to grasp that it's usually a global thing, you know? So if you're trying to be creative with language, you're not just going to use that hemisphere in those areas, you're going to use your whole brain. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, you know? But anyway, those are neuromyths, and they are incredibly present even today. And I'm really sorry to say that they can be an obstacle when we are designing learning experiences or teaching experiences as well. So that's why we need to understand them better. And I'll let my professor do the talking here. Paul Howard-Jones, professor of neuroscience and education at the University of Bristol, and I had the honor of studying under Professor Jones, and he said in a Nature review, the implicit assumption seems to be that because different regions of the cortex have crucial roles in visual, auditory, and sensory processing, learners should receive information in visual, auditory, and kinesthetic forms according to which part of their brain works better. The brain's interconnectivity makes such an assumption unsound, and reviews of educational literature and controlled laboratory studies fail to support this approach to teaching. So make sure you listen to Paul, and you can read more about this in many papers that are coming out even today. Yes. Now, why is this important? Before we carry on, I have to check if you're still paying attention. Are you still there? Are you on your phone looking at your Instagram notifications? Well, how about we do something that will help you consolidate this new knowledge, let's say. So I want you, for about 30 seconds to 1 minute, I want you to think about the things that I've discussed with you so far in this session, this masterclass, right? And try to remember those things, and to make sure you actually do what I'm asking you to do. Write down the things you can remember, share with someone, send someone a text message or something like that, so that it works, okay? So right now, you can pause the video for about 30 seconds or 1 minute, and then do the exercise. What can you remember about this masterclass so far? And make sure you write down or share with someone, okay? Okay, did you pause the video? I hope you did. What did you remember? If you're watching this here on Substack or YouTube, you can use the comment section, the chat, to leave your comments. I would love to know what came to your mind while you were doing this activity. Now, carrying on. So what do we do? If there are many prevalent neuromyths out there, if we're not metacognitive enough when it comes to our own learning and the learning of our students, what do? Are our hands tied? Is there anything we can do to improve teaching and learning? Yes. Here's what we can do. We look at the evidence. That's right. Not anecdotal evidence, because my friend said that he did that and it worked for him, or because I have this colleague who's a teacher and he did that and it worked on his students. The premise here is that you have to be skeptical. So it's empirical evidence. Of course, you can test something your colleague did to his or her students, but in a skeptical way. You have, okay, that makes sense, actually. It sounds plausible, even though we are very bad, poor judges of what is plausible or not, because, we're biased, right? So let me try with my students. Let me collect evidence and see if that actually works. A better way would be, is there any literature about this? Have people discussed this? Have people produced anything about this, right? Have people published something? Are there experts talking about this? And then you try, and then you see for yourself. Now, because if there's one thing we know about human beings, is that we're not great when it comes to assessing objective reality, based on our senses, our feelings. That's why we create instruments. That's why we need consensus. We're not the best when it comes to seeing facts, right? So where does the evidence come from? like I said before, it comes from the science of learning. Now, the science of learning is this incredible new area of knowledge that I studied for a while, especially during my master's course at the University of Bristol. And my dissertation was about neuromyths and facts and whether teachers base their lessons on those neuromyths or not, how frequent or how often they used certain concepts to base their lessons on. And then out of my dissertation, I actually created something that I call now the Learning Cosmos Conceptual Framework. And before you go like, okay, oh, what is that? This is not a method. This is not an approach. This is just a framework that helps you understand what concepts are important when you're teaching and when you're learning, because they are aligned with science of learning authors. So they are aligned with the science of learning literature. Now, not just science of learning, because science of learning is a bad name, maybe. Maybe we shouldn't call it science of learning or learning sciences because it feels like there's only one. But there are many fields here, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, even other branches of psychology, machine learning, computer science, engineering. There's so many, mental health, medicine. They all have to do with how we learn, how we can learn best. So what I tried to do with the Learning Cosmos conceptual framework was to frame those into a useful illustration. And I was inspired, as the name probably tells you, by some astrophysicists, especially Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan, because I was reading their work. And I'm a nerd and geek. And also Bronfenbrenner, who was the creator of the ecological systems theory. So there are concentric circles with different things that affect the learner. So I was thinking about different levels of concepts that we should understand. And I tried to make this illustration look like the cosmos, like the universe. You have the planetary level, you have the solar system level, and then you have the interstellar level and so on, right? So I talk about here in this illustration, the research by a lot of very important people. So I talk about engagement, build, and consolidation and feedback. And that comes from the research of Paul Howard-Jones, my former professor, but also people like Stanislas Dehaene, a French neuroscientist. I also talk about emotions and Lisa Feldman, for example, and Daniel Goleman, and other people who talk about regulation, like Stuart Shanker. They're all there. I also talk about beliefs and attitudes that can influence learning. Metacognition, John Flavel, you know. I also talk about self-efficacy by Albert Bandura, even growth mindset, even though it's becoming more and more controversial because of how people use it. But you have to know about the research, right? So it's also there. So anyway, this illustration, the Learning Cosmos conceptual framework, is a bunch of very important concepts coming from the learning sciences that I think you should be more familiar with if you are trying to design better learning and teaching experiences based on the evidence, based on the literature. So I hope it's useful. It's very complex, I understand that, but you know, like somebody said, I was interviewing Carl Hendrick, and he quoted someone, I don't remember who, but he said, all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. So I hope this is a useful model or framework for you to use, right? And it's also based on the elephant story, right? The metaphor, remember that? So the metaphor is that no one person by themselves can actually see reality as objectively as possible, because we are all biased and we all have limitations. And I think the learning sciences, or the science of learning, or as I mentioned, the mind-brain education science, they will look at everything. They will look at everything that is available to help you understand how learning takes place. So that's why it's interdisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary even, because it's not just one thing. It's a bunch of things helping you make decisions. If you are a policymaker, if you are an educator, if you are a teacher in the classroom, if you are a parent, if you are a student. So that's why it's important. Not just a bunch of blind men trying to figure out stuff by themselves, because blind in the sense that they don't know what's out there, but people who are not blind, or even if they are blind, they have instruments to help them, guide them, and they're communicating and trying to get the whole truth, or we will never get the whole truth, I suppose, but as close to the truth as possible. That's the idea. Now, what can I tell you about this science of learning based on the literature, the authors? I can tell you the following. Let's start with this guy, John Sweller, the father of cognitive load theory. He said something that has everything to do with the science of learning. Without an understanding of human cognitive architecture, instruction is blind. Yes, again, this word blind. So what I'm trying to say here, folks, is that learning is not magical. I mean, it is magical, of course. When you learn, that's amazing. It's magical. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not something that cannot be explained as most people think. Even though we still have to learn a lot about the brain and the mind and consciousness and all of that, that's true. But we have learned so much. There's so much out there, We have learned a lot about cognitive processes. We know things like John Sweller talks about David Geary's biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge, for example. Very interesting concepts for us to understand how brains acquire knowledge, how we learn certain things that are either a result of evolution or socially constructed, So it's very, very important for us to know those things in order to better prepare lessons and better prepare study sessions, right? Tracy Tokuhama mentioned someone. I don't know if she was the one who quoted that, and she's very important. You'll see her in a moment. It's like trying to design a glove without an understanding of the physiology or actually the anatomy of a hand, So there are certain things that need to happen in order for people to learn. It's not like everybody learns in a very different way. As a matter of fact, another person I would like to quote here, I am a big fan of this man, amazing, Jared Cooney Horvath. He says that every human being learns exactly the same way. And please follow Jared. He has a very interesting YouTube channel. Check out his Learning Blueprint program. It's amazing. I was honored, privileged really, to do a pilot here in Brazil with a school. And such an amazing program. If you want to know more, make sure you Google, you look it up. And what he's saying here is really what I think most people in the area agree with now, that just like digestion, learning follows certain rules and patterns and a sequence for it to happen. So if you are eating something and you have a certain height or weight, it might take longer or not for you to digest based on certain things relating to your body, your body mass and things like that, your conditions. But it's the very same things will happen to a person who is 5 or 6 feet tall, or I don't like this system, because I'm Brazilian, but let's say 190 meters tall or 2 meters tall or something like that, or 150 or 160, the food is going through the same organs and, the juices in your gut, in your stomach, they will act the same way. So, of course, there is sequence, a way, a procedure, let's say, for things to be digested in your body. But yeah, some people are allergic to certain kinds of food, and some people, because they are heavier, they need more food to be satisfied, or if you eat too fast, you might not feel that you've eaten enough, or so there are certain elements, of course, but again, the physiology of eating and digesting food is, or the process or the mechanics is pretty much the same, right? But then comes, and I told you I was going to talk about this woman, and I'm also a huge fan, Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, a world reference in the science of mind-brain education, and I highly recommend you start following her. Follow Conexiones, very interesting platform about learning how to learn. Follow anything related to mind-brain education. And she seems to disagree with Jared here. If every human being learns exactly the same way, how can human beings with very unique brains learn exactly the same way? Well, she's talking about how even though faces, they have the same parts, we have eyes, we have noses, we have lips, our mouth. We all look different. We can be very similar to some people. I think we call them doppelganger, right? So, but, or we can have a twin sibling or something like that. But it's just how things are kind of arranged on our face that will give us that uniqueness, just like things are arranged in the brain because of genetics, epigenetics even, and our ancestors and the things they were exposed to, but also our environment, right? So as we are exposed to certain things, our upbringing, our context, we will have very unique experiences, even though they might be very similar to other people, but the way we faced those challenges, our emotional state and everything will definitely have a different impact on us. So that means, and Tracy Tokuhama says here, that we do have universal principles of how we learn, just like Jared said. There are universal principles of how we learn that apply to every brain, regardless of individual differences. But there are individual differences that will influence those principles. Like I said, going back to the digestion example, depending on how heavy you are, how tall you are, some allergies you might have, or even the quality of the food you're getting, your digestion will be better or not, right? Something like that. So that means we need to learn those universal principles, and we have to help our students, if we are educators, or ourselves, understand the individual differences that will impact the results there. What do I mean by that? Well, let's honor Jared Cooney Horvath with the learning blueprint, So let's say there is a learning blueprint. There is a sequence of things that need to happen for you to learn something. And when we look at the models out there and the research, and there have been decades of research, we come up with this. For people to learn, for anyone to learn really, there has to be attention. Going back to the Learning Cosmos conceptual framework, I say engagement and attention, right? So that's based on Stanislas Dehaene's book, How We Learn. And because we are exposed to so many things on a daily basis, there's just a lot of stimuli all over the place. The way the brain found, through natural selection and evolution to actually learn things that are pertinent, let's say, for our survival was to focus on certain things, right? So that's one type of attention. So if you do not pay attention, those stimuli will not reach your working memory, and then you cannot really learn. There are other types of learning that are not really reliant on your working memory, as far as we can tell, like procedural knowledge. And, someday, if you're interested, come talk to me and I'll explain that. But I'm talking specifically about the type of learning that we're concerned with in formal education, or when you're studying for an exam, things like that, right? You need to pay attention. Otherwise, those things will not get into your working memory. And that's the next step, really. As you are paying attention, certain things will fill your working memory. And then the problem is that they will not stay there forever. Actually, they will stay there for just a little time, you know. And that means that if you don't do anything with that information, that new content, it's not going to turn into learning. So learning depends on memory, yes, different memory systems, and on attention. Without attention, you cannot create new memory because you don't receive or incorporate, let's say, those stimuli. And without rehearsing or applying this new memory, in most cases, there are exceptions, of course, we can learn things instantly sometimes, depending on the stakes. And anyway, you don't send those things to your long-term memory, and there's no learning, right? So that's the learning blueprint. And we know so much about those processes now because of the science of learning. We understand the transitions. We understand what will make learning more effective and less effective based on cognitive psychology and neuroscience and educational psychology and all of that, right? Yes, that's the science of learning, folks. It's amazing, right? I'll give you some examples, okay? So how do you move something from your attentional network to your working memory, right? So, okay, you are in the classroom, or you're in your office, your studio, and you have to learn something. Now, if you are looking at your phone because whatever is on the screen of your phone is more interesting, then your attention is divided, is fragmented. So you're not really paying attention. You're not focusing here. So that's a problem. So the thing that you need to actually learn will be compromised in a way because you're looking at your phone. So dividing your attention is bad. Multitasking is bad, right? But let's say you put your phone away, or you turn it off and you put it away from you, and then you can focus, okay? So now that's your cognitive resource, a very important cognitive resource, your attention, telling your brain, okay, this is important. We need to do this. We need to study this. We need to learn this. Okay, so this thing will make its way into your working memory. Now, John Sweller, father of cognitive load theory, says that we have a special structure for processing novel information, and it's called the working memory. But the thing about working memory, he says, is that it has two major limitations. First, how much information it can hold at any given time, and how long it can hold it for. So the limitations here are related to capacity, so working memory capacity and also working memory duration. If you don't do anything with those new things, that new information that you're trying to learn, it will vanish, disappear. And then there's nothing left to be consolidated and learned, right? And it's far worse than what you normally think, folks. If you want to pause the video and try to answer this, how long do you think your working memory lasts usually? If you receive new information, how long will this information be there for? And so pause and try to answer that. Now, if you haven't paused, you can still pause and try to answer too. How long will those things be in your working memory? How many chunks of information or bits of information you can put in your working memory, you know? Yeah, so that varies a lot. There have been different studies showing that could be anywhere between 4 and 7, plus or minus 2 or something like that. Could be around 15 minutes if you think about Henry Molaison, but in reality, it's a couple of seconds unless you rehearse and you actually ascribe or assign relevance to what you're doing. I have to remember this, I have to remember. So that rehearsal process is very important as well. So it's just a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes, really, you know. And between 2 and, well, I said 4 and 7 plus or minus 2, right? So it could be between 2 and 9, let's say, depending on the size of the chunk and, you know. Yeah, so that's really bad. Now, something is in your working memory. What happens then? Again, we go back to John Sweller. If that thing that made its way into your working memory is too complicated, has many moving parts, is not really related to anything you already know, your prior knowledge, that will influence its cognitive load. So we need to work with the cognitive load. As Paul Kirchner says, we have to optimize your cognitive load, not necessarily reduce the cognitive load. It really depends on how much prior knowledge you have, what you're working with. So we need to understand how cognitive load theory works, really. What cognitive load theory is, the different types of cognitive load, how we can optimize when we're teaching, when we're learning. Otherwise, our instruction will be blind, remember? So that's something you should learn more about if you are interested in the science of learning. But there's more. Something is, like I said, in your working memory. How does it become learning? How does it turn into learning, long-term memory, right? The funny thing is that it's usually not what works best according to what you think that will actually work best. Like I showed you the paper, the things that we consider effective are not really effective. So from memory to learning, to actually long-term learning, we need to experience some difficulties, What does that mean? So the Bjorks, Robert Bjork, Elizabeth Bjork, they say that what's almost sinister, if you think of it in a certain way, is that those very same things that will enhance performance during the study period are not the things that will enhance your recall or use of that information when you really need it at a later time. In other words, they're talking about the difference between performance and learning. And come on, folks. I think everybody has experienced that. I know everybody has experienced that. Have you ever done pretty well on a test? Have you ever performed quite well? You got a 10, but then, just a couple of days later, sometimes even a couple of hours later, you couldn't really remember what the test was about, what the content was about. You studied really hard for some time, and okay, you aced the test, but then, if I ask you a question about the test tomorrow, you can't remember anything. Yeah, so have you ever, and this goes for other areas of life, have you ever practiced something really hard for a long time to perform in front of an audience maybe, and then you failed big time? So it's not that you didn't know or you hadn't learned that. They didn't have the skills, but when you were performing in front of an audience, that did something to your cognitive load, and then you couldn't do it. So you see that performing well is not an indication or a very good indication that you have learned something, and vice versa, So if you have learned something, it doesn't mean that you're always going to perform well, right? Yeah, and that brings us to another very important concept that you should know more about. Again, the Bjorks. I like to call them the legendary science of learning couple because, their work is phenomenal, very important. Their work has transformed the way we understand and see how things happen, when we're learning, right? So desirable difficulties. Usually, if you're doing something that feels easy enough to study for an exam or to try to learn something, so to send that information from your working memory to your long-term memory, if it's easy enough, if it feels easy, like, rereading is easy. If you think it's passive, even though you're actively reading, it's kind of passive. That will not generate long-term learning. As a matter of fact, what you should be doing to learn, to make sure you are learning, you should be testing yourself, not just going over the material again, right? To see, because if we have learned something, usually we can recall that pretty easily. Not always, because there's a different strength there, recalling something, actually recalling something and knowing something. It could depend on different things, but usually if you know something, if I know, so what is the capital of, I don't know, Greece? If I know that, I should be able to recall that quite easily, right? Whenever I need that. So if I test myself, instead of, okay, I know what the capital of Greece is, but let me go to the book just to make sure. and then I'm not testing myself. I will just read from the book or from my notes, from my summaries. Then testing yourself makes a lot of sense, because it's an added difficulty that will actually help you strengthen those neuronal connections, the network, because we save stuff in the brain or store things in the brain as networks of neurons, right? So you should learn more about desirable difficulties, right? Well, I'll give you an example based on cognitive load theory and desirable difficulties, okay? So here are two strategies that we can use really as a way to ensure, let's say, that we are learning more effectively, because they're based on learning principles, right? So the first one is analogies. Analogies can help you work with your working memory and work with your cognitive load. Did I use any analogy with you, on you today in this masterclass? I think I did, right? Which one? If you want to pause the video and try to retrieve that. As a matter of fact, the other one is retrieval practice. Did I use that with you as well? Okay. Why am I testing you? So I used the elephant analogy to talk about the science of learning, mind-brain education. It's or even transdisciplinarity, right? Because I think that's a very powerful metaphor that will help you understand it better. So I use that to try to optimize your cognitive load. So I used that while I was giving you input, right? So I used an analogy to try to make your cognitive load more optimal while giving you input. But if I expect you to learn anything, really learn, long-term learning, send whatever I'm teaching you here to your long-term memory, then I have to have you retrieve, not just go over the material or check your notes or anything like that. And that has to do with desirable difficulties, and we should use that for output, right? Did I do that to you? Did I ask you to retrieve certain things? When I'm telling you to pause and think about something, it might be, retrieving from your long-term memory things that you already have. But, there was a certain point a while ago that I said, are you still paying attention? Then I asked you to pause for 30 seconds or 1 minute to try to pull back, from your memory, literally, we could say, those things that I was discussing in this masterclass, right? So there are many things, I'm talking about one of Bjork's desirable difficulties. Retrieving is one, and it's based on the testing effect. There are others, so sometimes you will come across 4, or sometimes you'll come across 5. They have papers on it, Bob and Liz Bjork, as they like being called. They have amazing lectures about this. So again, you need to learn more, but not just learn the strategies, folks. Those strategies, they will work differently under different circumstances because of, what about, remember digestion, right? What if there is a condition I'm not aware of? Neurodiversity, for example. What if my student's mental state is not really conducive to learning now, so they won't be able to retrieve now, even though it's there in their prior memory, prior knowledge, right? So it's not just applying these strategies blindly. No secret or fixed formulas here, folks, okay? You have to learn the learning principle behind them, and I'm not putting you folks in a straitjacket and telling you this is how you have to teach because this is how the brain learns. No, I'm giving you information that will be quite useful when you're preparing your lessons, when you're delivering your lessons, planning your lessons, when you're thinking and rethinking about your lessons, or when you are studying yourselves, when you're designing your study sessions, right? I'm not dictating what you have to do. You have to learn the learning principles, and then you can choose based on evidence, of course, what might work best under those circumstances, right? Well, there's more. There's a lot more. But I will wrap up here because I hope this was useful. I hope this was interesting. And I want to tell you more about the work that I do. If you like this masterclass, if you like this information I'm sharing with you, you can subscribe to this channel, to this podcast. You know, I have a podcast. As a matter of fact, I told you that I don't like the title of masterclass, but if you really want to have a masterclass from the real masters, you know, go to the Learning Cosmos podcast, because I was incredibly honored to have some of those brilliant minds on the podcast as guests. So I interviewed John Sweller, the father of cognitive load theory, the super couple, the science of learning couple, Bob and Liz Bjork. So you can listen to the podcast or watch it on Substack or YouTube and learn from the masters themselves and others. I have a lot of episodes available now. Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa was the last one already available. Carl Hendrick, John Sweller is there. Henry Roediger III, one of the co-authors of one of the best sellers, like huge success, Make It Stick, a book that every educator, parent, teacher in the classroom, even students, you know, every student should read to understand learning better. Carolina Cooper-Tetzel, Sarah Oberly, my Professor Paul Howard-Jones, Nidhi Sachdeva, and the one and only Jared Cooney-Horvath, who was the first guest on the podcast. So please make sure you follow the podcast. I'm very proud of this podcast, you know, the Learning Cosmos podcast. But there's more. There's more free stuff if you want. You can go to Substack and follow my blog. So I try to write things from a science of learning angle. And I try to analyze, you know, papers and for claims and things like that. I also try to be active on Instagram. So if you are an Instagram fan, even though multitasking, fragmenting your attention, but, you know, just try to control yourself, okay? Self-regulation. You can follow me on Instagram at The Learning Cosmos, right? But here's the thing. Let me end with this important message. Remember the elephant analogy, right? There's another version that I consider it to be my favorite version, I think, because it's important for us to look at things from a fresh perspective, right? So it's like I said, a Buddhist or Hindu parable. It goes back, you know, thousands of years. And in this version, there were 7 wise men who happened to be blind. So there were 7 wise blind men who were basically always trying to prove that they were the wisest of them all. So each one of them was trying to prove that he was the wisest of them all. And they were always analyzing things. They were always trying to come up with a solution to problems they had in the village, in this town, until this beast they had never heard of, the elephant, was brought into town. And they heard that there was this animal there, and they wanted to prove, they wanted to explain to each other what this animal was like, you know. So they wanted to be the best at describing and understanding this animal, and they did exactly as the previous version. They touched different parts of this animal, and one of them said, "Oh, this is a snake," upon touching the trunk. The other one touched the leg of the elephant. "This is a tree trunk." And the other one touched the ear of the elephant. "This is a fan." And the other one touched the side of the animal. "This is a wall." And the other one touched the tail of the animal. "This is a rope," and so on. They got into a huge fight, and they went their separate ways. And one of them decided to go to the hills. He ran to the hills, you know. And after a period of contemplation, he came down, and he grabbed a child, and he gathered the other wise blind man, and he asked this child to pick up a stick from the ground and to actually draw the outline of this animal in the sand. And then using their fingers, they touched, felt the outline of this animal. And this seventh wise blind man, who was the first one to do it, said, all of you are right and wrong at the same time, because you are just analyzing this from your own limited perspective. But when you put all of those things together, you get the big picture, And that's my favorite version, because the wise, or the wisest of them all, maybe we can consider the seventh wise blind man the wisest of them all, but I like to think that the wisest of them all was the child, the child who put together the different parts to help them see, metaphorically speaking, what this beast or this big animal was all about, right? And I think that's what the science of learning is trying to do. Certainly what I am trying to do, the science of mind-brain education, which is a child, if you think about it, in terms of how long it's been around. It's a new science. It's a transdisciplinary science that tries to put together the different parts that are all pertinent for us, teachers, educators, students, parents, families, to understand learning from a more scientific perspective. So it's us, trying to draw the outline on the ground so that people can see and can find good, reliable information to design learning experiences, teaching experiences. That's why I believe the science of learning is quite important. The mind-brain education science is incredibly relevant to all of you. And if you want to know more about the science of learning now, let me tell you, there are other professional development opportunities. So this is special because I've been working on the Learning Cosmos Education Hub. So you can become a subscriber. So I have to pay a fee, of course, because this is the work that I do. I record courses, master classes, even though I don't like calling them that. So you can subscribe. You have different types of subscription. Just scan the QR code. You can find the links down here. Or you just Google Learning Cosmos Education Hub. I'm sure you're going to find the links. And now the coolest part of this masterclass is that if you want to study live with me, you can still do it. This week, I am offering 2 courses are starting, actually. One is the Science of Learning Foundations, and 12-hour online course, live, synchronous. Actually, it's 6 hours synchronous and 6 hours of individual study, taking place July 4th, 11th, 18th, and 25th. Those are the times: 7 a.m. Peru, 9 a.m. Brazil, 1 p.m. UK. Oh no, I cannot join the live sessions. That's completely fine. Once you buy the course, you will have access to the platform, and I will upload the recordings there. So if you can join us live, that's awesome. If you can't, you can still watch the recorded sessions. So that's one. The other one is Metacognition Beyond Learning, How to Learn. And again, same structure, 12 hours, 6 hours live, 6 hours individual study. And that will take place on Saturday. So Science of Learning on Fridays and Metacognition on Saturdays, July 5th, 12th, 19th, and 26th at 12 p.m. Peru, 2 p.m. Brazil, 6 p.m. UK. Scan the QR codes and you have a discount now, okay? This is the last time I'm selling those courses for this price, I'm telling you, So you can still buy them. And if you need anything, really just talk to me. You'll have access to an ebook that I prepared exclusively with some of the information I've been discussing here and more. And that's it from me, folks. Remember, I really want the Learning Cosmos to be your go-to place, let's say, if you want to learn more about learning, if you want to learn more about how the brain processes and encodes and retrieves and retains information, and how we can use this knowledge of learning principles to actually transform the way we study and the way we teach. That's the idea. So I hope this was a useful masterclass, even though I don't know how I should call this thing, but okay, masterclass. And I hope that in case you are interested, come study with me, come join us. We're going to have a lot of fun. It's not going to be easy all the time because we need desirable difficulties to learn, right? But I'm sure it's going to be useful. And if you are a teacher, if you are an English teacher or a language teacher, if you are teaching anything else, general education, if you are a parent, if you are a family member who wants to understand learning better, if you're a policymaker, anything, really, these courses are for you. So thank you very much for watching this. And I hope to see you in my course, or I hope to have you at least subscribe to my blog on Substack and follow me on Instagram and subscribe to my podcast, the Learning Cosmos podcast. Thank you very much. That's it. Bye-bye.